All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, yesterday I covered Twitter's monstrously stupid idea to try and fact-check Trump's Twitter account. It opens Pandora's box in terms of political censorship of content, raises huge questions about which mainstream neoliberal organizations they're going to partner with, and overall, it's just a broader trend of establishment liberal activist Karens like Mika Brzezinski to outsource their political choices to a literal tech oligarch. But as I hinted at in the last part of yesterday's radar, Twitter's decision sparks a bigger and perhaps even more consequential. Is it a platform or a publisher? Its legal status as a platform essentially gives it legal immunity from much of the content on its website, under a provision called Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act, which was written to let internet companies flourish in the 1990s. However, with Twitter's decision in this particular case to employ political fact checks against Trump's Twitter account, they are now pretty explicitly in the publishing realm. Let me explain. Whenever you're in the publishing business, it comes with a lot of legal liability. We're publishers here. We can't just tell you anything without vetting it or act maliciously, because if we did, we'd rightfully be sued. As Senator Josh Hawley put it in a letter to Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey, quote, "Instead of allowing viewers to look at the dialogue around the president's tweets and assess them for themselves, the merits of the president's views, Twitter decided to editorialize, appending its own comments and assessment to the president's speech," adding, "Traditional publishers are liable when they mess up, but under Section 230, Twitter receives a special government carve-out that shields it from liability. That statute tells courts to treat Twitter like a passive distributor of third-party content, and Twitter's decision to affix its own editorial content to users' posts brings into the question the basis for that immunity." Now, it's difficult to put into words just how much Section 230 is worth to Twitter. Because of it, its content moderation is a fraction of what it would cost otherwise. It's not an exaggeration that it wouldn't exist if the privilege was taken away from them. But with the privilege and basic government subsidy of this law, it's supposed to be an understanding that the companies themselves will not act as publishers in an editorial capacity. So how else can you really describe Twitter's decision here? All of this I say as someone who has long been skeptical of a whole conservative bias on social media thing. I think a lot of conservatives use it as an excuse for just not being very good at social media. But in this particular case, it seems overwhelming. The person literally in charge of fact-checking Trump and all world leaders' tweets is a guy named Yoel Roth. And Yoel's own tweets show that he donated to Hillary Clinton in 2016, said of Midwestern states, quote, "We fly over those states that they voted for a racist tangerine for a reason," and once compared White House advisor Kellyanne Conway to Joseph Goebbels. I will forgive him for the last one, which I honestly found kind of funny, when he wrote, "How does a personality-free bag of farts like Mitch McConnell actually win elections?" Now, it doesn't take much work to see which side Yoel plays for. And if Twitter is now in the publishing business, then who he plays for matters a whole great deal. Because if Twitter, however, behaved within the constraints of the law of Section 230, acting as a third-party platform for speech, then Yoel's views really wouldn't matter all that much. Now, I want to end with this. Right now, this is a Trump story. But think about the far-reaching implications of a Silicon Valley neoliberal Hillary bot who hates Midwesterners making huge decisions about our political discourse. Do any of you think that this won't matter if an anti-establishment left politician ever runs for office? Do you want to see AOC's claims about Medicare for All fact-check using hospital industry-funded studies? Our political discourse is up to us. If Trump says something that isn't true, the media can and does call him out on it. It's up to voters to decide whether that untruthfulness matters to them in the context of their own priorities. That is an actual democracy. This is just the latest step forward to technocratic oligarchy. It must be resisted by anybody who cares about keeping a shred of freedom in our current political discourse. And that's the thing that I really care about, Crystal, which is that you can very much see the far-reaching implications of letting Pete Buttigieg types rule what is true and what is not.
They already do, to be honest with you.
Exactly, but that's the thing. So even to the very limited extent, what do people like you and me and other anti-establishment people have? We have the internet. We have Twitter, we have Facebook, Instagram, whatever. That is a way in which we can bypass the mainstream media, connect with our audience of like-minded folks, and not have to go through the traditional corporate-controlled pipes of information.
Yeah.
Now, we've always recognized that the non-corporate control pipes of information are corporate in themselves. But now they're teaming up with the existing power infrastructure in order to fact-check. Again, fact-checking is an obviously political thing. And you can completely see, by the way, that this is being recognized by the highest echelons of Silicon Valley because Mark Zuckerberg went on Fox News yesterday. The interview is airing today, saying, I believe very strongly, Facebook shouldn't be the arbiter of truth anything. And that's especially true for platform companies because Zuckerberg understands that what Jack has done is unleash Pandora's box.
It's a mortal threat.
Yeah, the Trump administration, Trump is scheduled to sign an executive order today, which according to the New York Times is going to review exactly what I talked about here, Section 230 of authority of social media companies.
Right. The irony is probably no one has benefited more from Twitter than Trump.
No chance.
And, fact checks or whatever you want to throw at him, no one has really exploited the medium more effectively to greater impact than Donald Trump, which is precisely why, Mika and a whole army of resistance liberals are going after his Twitter account. I understand the impulse because some of what he tweets out is obnoxious, terrible, and wrong. I get that. However, number one, there's a fantasy involved here that by throwing a fact check up there or even deplatforming him from Twitter, that you're going to be able to shut down and silence the president of the United States. That's a fantasy.
It's ludicrous.
And if Twitter actually did the thing that you wanted and took President Trump off of Twitter, the backlash that you would face would be so not worth whatever minor decrease in, in hearing his words that you were able to accomplish. So there's just on the political strategy piece, I think it's less about outcomes and more about being on the right side of the latest virtue signaling battle is my personal view. What you're laying out here, and I think people understand this, but just to be really clear, is if you're a platform, then you aren't responsible for all the crazy ass stuff that people post on Twitter, right? It's not your responsibility. You're just providing the technology, they're doing whatever they're doing, and you're sort of hands off. Yeah. If you're a publisher, then you are in this position of editorializing, as you are with the president's tweets here, basically saying, hey, check out the facts, essentially implying that this is not accurate or factual information. That is a sort of inherently editorial decision because, certain things are black and white, like 1 + 1 = 2. Other things that require studies, they have nuance, there's different perspective. It's not always so cut and dry as we know. And as anti-establishment figures, we have certainly seen time and time again the way that they can add 1 + 1 = 3 if it's going to benefit their perspective over your perspective. So no one should consider that this is going to be a good actor. Even, it's a lot safer of a direction if you are that sort of Pete Buttigieg type neoliberal, but no one should feel comfortable with basically one person who is unelected and unaccountable deciding what goes and what doesn't go, what's fact and what's fiction, et cetera, et cetera. No one should feel okay with that, but especially people who hold heterodox views should be very uncomfortable with that. In terms of, what is the direction going forward? Do you really think that they will, require them to be treated as publishers and basically end Twitter and Facebook? Do you think that really is a feasible direction to go in?
No, but I think that wielding the threat is totally worth it because look, if you're going to behave outside of the strictures of the law, and I think people need to understand, as you said, when Twitter is not responsible for the crazy stuff that people say, that is a subsidy. Because if they were responsible, they would, like you and I, have to have people who work for us, who have know editorial standards or who have editorial standards, who can fact check things, who can make sure that things are correct before they reach out to somebody for comment if somebody is going to slander them, etc. So this literally saves them billions, tens of billions of dollars,
right,
in not having to moderate any of the content that's on their platform. That matters quite a bit in this particular case, because if they're going to start editorializing, fact-checking, etc., then why should they get that legal subsidy? I'm not even saying take it away. I'm saying hold it as a cudgel, because the government's job is actually both to enforce its own law on the book, which is the Section 230, but also it's in order to protect the speech of, look, I mean, this comes down to a bigger question of, I think, where you and I fall similarly, which is that these platforms are now so big that they're essential and they have so much power. And it would be I mean, anytime somebody's like, go build your own Twitter, it's like, do you know what that, I mean, the market power, again, that's like saying to a worker, something that we know very well, well, if you don't like what you're getting paid, go work somebody else.
Yeah.
Well, if
you have a choice.
If you work in a town with one factory that has a monopoly on the wage, how are you going to do that, folks?
Right.
So, like, this is a very intuitive economic idea to the both of us.
That is the part that it always comes back to, which makes all of this very uncomfortable, is just the amount of power. I mean, Facebook is like a nation state at this point. And the amount
they behave that way.
And they do behave that way. We covered here how they have now this like governing board, like sort of Supreme Court of Facebook, to adjudicate these types of disputes. And that's really where this becomes so problematic, is not only are they so large, but they become so essential to how all of us consume and process information, that bigness itself is an issue regardless of, are they a platform, are they a publisher, et cetera. Like that size itself. I mean, let's just carry out this sort of theoretical here, hypothetical. Let's say that they get classed as a publisher, and now they are actually in the business of like moderating everything and kicking people off and fact checking, and they're actually figured out some way to do that. It doesn't actually solve the problem. That's actually worse, because now they're now they're actually engaged in this huge way in cultivating and curating and fact checking and pushing us all in one direction or another, which, look, Facebook does a lot of this already with their algorithms and what they serve you and the sort of personality profiles that they build and all the data that they collect. So to a large extent, it's the size and the power and how essential they are at this point that is really the core issue.
Yeah, and it's about their power, especially in terms of our political discourse, because politics, and this is why all we want is for them to act like platforms. If you act like a platform, if you stick to that, then the impact on our political discourse is much, much less. And then it makes what democracy is, what politics is arguing, the public square, etc. That's why I think Twitter is a good thing. I mean, I know it's a hell site occasionally, but like overall,
it's a hell site.
It's generally always a hell site, and people are pretty annoying. But being able to put out ideas, argue with some of the leaders in your field, from afar, that is great. Like, I'm a techno-optimist in some senses. I think that is a great innovation. But whenever that becomes the dominant political discussion, and that becomes the forum of American politics today, which I don't think you could ever argue that it's not, is that then the editorializing within that discussion, that becomes an instrument of power in and of itself, acting on behalf of these neoliberal mainstream organizations, which have a view that just conveniently lines up with their advertisers, who are all massive Fortune 500 companies. That's what I think is one of the clearest direction of power dynamics on how this is going to go.
Yeah, and they already wield a lot of power in shaping the discourse and who gets heard and who doesn't with the design of the systems. With even things like, who do you give a blue check mark to, right? Ryan Grimm covered how fewer progressive challengers were getting those blue check marks, which gives you credibility, which helps you to get seen and heard. And
helps you raise money.
Raise money, all of those things. And so it's deeply uncomfortable how every little decision that these massive platforms make, how that reverberates throughout our politics, our political discourse, our understanding of news, of who's credible, of who's not, and all of that. There are no easy answers to any of that, but the size, the ubiquity, how essential it has become to all of this is kind of the really root of the problem.
Yeah, certainly. All right, I want to make sure I give a shout out to Drew. Thank you for suggesting that radar to me on my Instagram. If you want to suggest one to me, you may as well. And I'm looking forward now to Crystal's radar.